Chapter 6, Choosing the Time. Here's a beautiful rendition of the water serpent. Looks like the Kiva stairs. 1, 2, 3, 4 of them. Perhaps these are some of the mountaintops. When should we strike? This question came up again and again. It would obviously make good sense to strike when the metal people were weakest. But when would that be? How could the Indians tell? It would be best to attack the metal people. It would be best to attack when the metal people had used up most of their powder and when their old firearms were worn out. The village dwellers must strike for freedom when the Spanish storerooms were empty. Pope knew that the Spaniards were hungriest for everything just before the arrival of the supply train, which came from Mexico every third spring or summer. This was a year when the great caravan was due. The metal people would be waiting for new harquebuses and more powder and ball to use in them. The wagons would bring new swords, daggers, and shields. There would also be more armor and more horses that could trample the Indians underfoot. Of special importance was one other fact that Pope knew. This year, the supply train would be late. Pope, like all other Tewas, had watched the weather carefully all his life. Now he was studying it with the greatest possible attention, and what he observed had dramatic possibilities for the revolution. The snowfall in the mountains above Big River had been heavy in the winter of 1679 and 1680. The spring that followed was cool, so the snow was late in melting. When the hot days of July did arrive, the melting was sudden and massive. The waters of Big River rose and rose. Where the river was usually shallow enough for fording, the water was deep and swift, and it flooded outward over low banks, making it impossible for wagons to cross. If the supply train reached Big River in July, it would be stopped on the far side by the unusually high water. Pope knew this, and so did other leaders. As long as the wagon train was motionless on the far side, the munitions that were so vital to the Spaniards would be held up. They would be useless, and if the midsummer rains came soon enough to keep the water high, the supply train would have to wait still longer. Pope, Katiti, Saka, Flatnose, and others watched the weather. They watched the level of the water in the river, and finally they decided that the supply train would be held up far to the south, late in August. Obviously, the best time for the rising would be earlier in August, about the time when the first corn was getting ripe. This would be in the second week of August on the Spanish calendar. Messengers went out all over Aztlan with the news that definite plans for the rising had now been made and that the date had been set and would be announced later. It was important that each messenger would explain the plan correctly. So Pope and his colleagues used a device that people in Red Willow had learned from Indians who lived on the Great Plains and who occasionally came to visit them. They painted pictures on deer hides, which the messengers carried with them. Each picture was a private symbol to remind a messenger of certain things he was to say. If he was captured by Spanish soldiers, he would tell anything he wanted. He could tell anything he wanted about the pictures, except the truth. The deerskins on which the revolutionary leaders painted their symbols have been lost. Today, we don't know what those symbols were, but the messengers knew and understood them. The painted hides went from village to village as far west as the distant home of the Big Leggings people, and the most responsible men in Aztlan knew that the time for revolution was at hand. No one dreamed that the tyrants could ever be persuaded to leave the country merely because it was right and just for them to depart. Only force could free this land, which had been seized by force and held by force. If the Spaniards could be induced to leave peacefully, that would suit the Indians very well. It would not then be necessary to kill any of them and to risk Indian lives in the process. None of the leaders, however, had any doubt that some of the enemy must be killed in order to persuade the others to leave, and the killing had to be carefully planned if it was to do its grim work of persuading. Upriver, outside Beadwater, every single metal person must die, all of them. There can be no exceptions. Governor Otermin must be convinced that we will kill all the metal people in Nazan if they don't leave. This was the way Pope reasoned. This was the way all the rebel leaders reasoned. They agreed that upriver every man, woman, and child must be killed in the first hours of the revolution. The attacks must all be made at the same time. Clearly, if the Indians struck everywhere at once, the metal people would not be able to help one another. There were not enough soldiers in Beadwater to defend all the farms and estates and settlements and churches at the same time. As soon as the revolutionaries destroyed the metal people upriver, they planned to give Governor Otermin and his followers a chance to leave Aztlan. If Otermin wouldn't leave peacefully, they would drive him out or destroy him. The leaders of the revolution shared this idea, and they told it to trusted men in much of the valley. The corn began to grow ripe, and the season for the rising drew near, but the Indians had no calendars. They had to work out some other device so that the rising would take place everywhere on the same day at the same hour. Someone, perhaps it was Pope, came up with the idea of sending out runners with knotted cords. The number of knots would indicate the number of days left before the rising was to begin at dawn. Many leaders in the upriver villages knew the general plan, but Pope, Katiti, Saka, and a very few others shared the secret part of it with no one. Remembering his son-in-law, Pope was not sure that any Tuyos could be trusted, even though they seemed to support the revolution. At the last moment, some of them might think that their future was safer with the Spaniards, from whom they got their power and privileges. They might betray the revolution and give Otermin the warning he needed in order to defeat the great plan. How, then, could the undependable men be handled? It must have been Pope who suggested sending out a false date for the rising. If Otermin heard of the state, he would begin to make preparations with the wrong date in mind. And if Otermin's soldiers got busy all of a sudden, the revolutionaries would know that they had been betrayed. They watched to see who ran to Otermin. If they watched to see who ran to Otermin, they would know who the traitors were. This false date must be later than the real one. Thus, Otermin would think he had more time to make his plans than he really had. Then the Indians would move against him before he was ready. In addition, this scheme would have the traitors working for the revolutionaries instead of doing them harm. The handful of leaders who heard of these proposals approved. A brilliant plan was now ready to be put into effect, a plan that had many ingenious parts, which carefully fitted into all the others. First, the multilingual traders would overcome the language barriers and prepare the way for the revolution, while appearing to do business as usual. Later, runners with painted deerskins and knotted cords would carry wordless messages which all leaders could understand. When the moment for action came, warriors without modern weapons were to seize such weapons from the enemy. By falling upon small, scattered settlements first, the rebels would risk least damage to themselves. At the same time, communications between Beadwater and other Spanish settlements were to be cut. The Spaniards in each place would then be convinced that those and others were destroyed and could not provide help. Without benefit of a calendar or clock, timing was precisely calculated to make possible a whole network of simultaneous surprise attacks. Timing was so subtly adjusted to the weather, which in turn controlled the arrival of supplies that the Spaniards sorely needed. Seldom have any oppressed people anywhere ever been better equipped with practical schemes for overcoming the obstacles that stood between them and their freedom. Rarely among the victims of the world's great empires was a leader like Pope Rarely among the victims of the world's great empires has a leader like Pope appeared who could manage so amazingly to unite so many different and proudly independent people who spoke so many diverse languages. By all accounts, Pope, working in Red Willow, was the chief architect of this unity, but we have no information about exactly where he was after the planning was completed, and the hour drew near for transforming his design for revolution into reality. Was the plan so perfectly conceived that it could now be carried out with any guiding intelligence at a command post? Perhaps, But it was hard to believe that Popé would not be near the center of the events, which would be the great achievement of his life. The events began to follow each other with almost an unbelievable rapidity, starting before daylight on August 9th. The center of activity, the village of Dry Spot, was only 9 miles from the main target, Beadwater, the Spanish capital. Dry Spot was also centrally located in relation to all the upriver villages. It was at Dry Spot that the runners, Katua and Omtua among them, were briefed in the pre-dawn hours on August 9th. So it was that Katua and Omtua started their run with the cords that were knotted to announce that the rising would begin August 13th. And so it was that Katua and Omtua rendered a great service to all the village's Indians when they revealed the date before their young lives suddenly ended.